Did you know your rights don't come from the Constitution or even the Bill of Rights? Today we're talking about the source of your rights and how you defend them. People often refer to their rights by amendment number. Doing so is not only a constitutional error, it's dangerous. Here are some examples you'll often hear. Creating a free speech zone is a violation of my First Amendment rights. Or, I will never let Bloomberg and his type take away my Second Amendment rights. The phrases First Amendment rights and Second Amendment rights, or any other amendment rights for that matter, imply that you get your rights as a grant from government or a document. People who hear these phrases learn that you get these rights because they're spelled out in the Bill of Rights. Some might even believe that they didn't exist until they were written down on paper. But nothing could be further from the truth. Your rights are yours by the very nature of your birth. You have them whether a document or a government says so or not. And while governments at every level will always work to limit or destroy your rights, it's up to you and others to defend them. Of course, the big question, how do you do that? Thomas Jefferson had what I believe to be the most important advice on this. He said, "A free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature, and not as a gift of their chief magistrate." In other words, we the people need to learn how to exercise our rights, whether the government wants us to or not. The founders had many reasons for setting up a decentralized system. I'll share one of the most important ones next. In an 1800 letter, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Our country is too large to have all its affairs directed by a single government." Today, the federal government really does try to direct virtually all of our affairs, from what our kids learn in school, to what plants we can grow in our own yards, to how much water we can have in our toilets. This is the kind of micromanaging that the founders warned us about. Jefferson's point is pretty straightforward. Bureaucrats, hundreds or even thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., simply can't grasp all the issues facing a local community. Since there is no way for them to understand what's needed locally, we end up with one-size-fits-all solutions that don't work for anybody. But the flip side of the coin might be even more dangerous. We don't really know what's going on in Washington, D.C., and we have absolutely no control over it either. Jefferson warned us about this too. He said this kind of situation will invite public agents to corruption, plunder, and waste. You don't have to look around too much to see that that's exactly what we have today. The founders didn't trust the executive branch to exercise complete power over war. James Madison put it this way: "The executive branch is the most interested in war and the most prone to it." The founders knew their history, so this was a common view. English kings took the country to war time and again, sometimes for the most trivial reasons. Because of this, the founders divided war powers. In the Constitution, Congress was delegated the power to declare war, that is, to decide if the country would go to war and against whom. The president was delegated the power to wage war once Congress declared it. Thomas Jefferson put it this way in a letter to James Madison. He said the Constitution creates one effectual check to the dog of war by transferring the power of letting him loose from the executive to the legislative body. Rights aren't gifts from government. Every so often, somebody tells us that non-citizens don't have rights in America. But this shows a complete misunderstanding of where rights come from. It implies that rights come from government. To say that non-citizens have no rights is absurd. You don't get rights because you were born inside some arbitrarily drawn border. Some people were simply lucky to be born in an area where government violates their rights less than in other areas. Fact: every person on Earth was born with the same natural rights. Thomas Jefferson alluded to this in the Declaration of Independence. He wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." Of course, you don't have to believe in a creator. You can simply say that natural rights are a basic part of our personhood. To assume that government gives you rights takes you down a very dangerous path. After all, whatever government gives, government can take away. The Constitution delegates the power to declare war to Congress and not the President. A leading University of Virginia constitutional law professor did an in-depth study of the founding era understanding of the phrase, "to declare war." He concluded that the founders and the founding generation understood the phrase as meaning to decide to enter a war, and includes acts of war as well as formal declarations of war. In other words, the act of establishing a no-fly zone, ordering a drone strike, or dropping bombs is fundamentally a declaration of war, and the president doesn't have the constitutional authority to do it without authorization from Congress. Here's how George Washington put it. The Constitution vests the power of declaring war with Congress. Therefore, no offensive expedition of importance can be undertaken until after they have deliberated upon the subject and authorized such a measure. It wasn't just Thomas Jefferson and James Madison who supported nullification. During the 1788 Hillsborough Convention, delegates from North Carolina opposing ratification of the Constitution outnumbered those in favor by about 2-1. One of the greatest concerns was about the extent of powers delegated to the federal government, and the lack of a Bill of Rights at that time. Archibald McLean was a well-known attorney in the state and was a leader there in opposition to the Stamp Act years earlier. He argued in favor of ratification and suggested nullification as a response to federal overreach. He said, "If Congress should make a law beyond its powers and the spirit of the Constitution, should we not say to Congress, 'You have no authority to make this law. There are limits beyond which you cannot go. You cannot exceed the power prescribed by the Constitution. You are amenable to us for your conduct. That act is unconstitutional. We will disregard it and punish you for the attempt." Although ratification initially failed, McLean and other supporters of the Constitution in North Carolina continued to make the case that the new general government would be limited, and the state would have recourse if the feds overstepped their bounds. The state ratified a year later based largely on these arguments. Did you know the federal government shouldn't even be funding infrastructure? It might sound shocking, but it's true. In fact, James Madison actually vetoed a public works bill funding infrastructure in 1817, calling it unconstitutional. The bill was for constructing roads and canals and improving the navigation of watercourses in order to facilitate, promote, and give security to internal commerce among the several states. Virtually every American today would say that this is exactly what the feds should be doing, but the father of the Constitution disagreed. Madison said, "The legislative powers vested in Congress are specified and enumerated, and it does not appear that the power proposed to be exercised by the bill is among the enumerated powers, or that it falls by any just interpretation with the power to make laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution those or other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States. The amazing thing is that Madison actually favored the bill personally, but he vetoed it anyway because he put the Constitution above his personal policy preferences. That's the kind of integrity you should never count on from Washington, D.C. today. One of the most important founding fathers is someone that most people have never even heard of. John Dickinson is best known as the penman of the Revolution. In response to the hated Townshend Acts, he wrote a series of 12 essays known as Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. They were widely read in the colonies and acted as a driving force against the British. Dickinson was also a member of the Continental Congress, which coordinated resistance during the early years of the Revolutionary War. During his tenure, he drafted two important pre-war documents, a petition to the king and the Olive Branch Petition, both attempts to negotiate peace. But when negotiations failed, Dickinson wrote the final draft of the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. But despite his prominent role, he refused to sign the Declaration of Independence. It's because he believed the colonies should formally unite and seek foreign alliances first. To that end, Dickinson did agree to head a committee to draft up a constitution for the Union of the States. The committee presented Dickinson's first draft of the Articles of Confederation to the Congress on July 12, 1776. Dickinson later served as a Delaware delegate to the Philadelphia Convention that drafted the Constitution. He supported ratification with a series of essays known as the Fabius Letters. In these, he showed his strong support for state sovereignty. He wrote, "A territory of such extent as that of United America could not be safely and advantageously governed, but by a combination of republics, each retaining all the rights of supreme sovereignty excepting such as ought to be contributed to the Union." John Dickinson was Delaware's wealthiest farmer and largest slaveholder. However, in 1777, he freed all of his slaves. In fact, he was the only founder to do so during the period of 1776 to 1786. When learning of his death, Thomas Jefferson wrote that John Dickinson was among the first of the advocates for the rights of his country, whose name will be consecrated in history as one of the great worthies of the Revolution. Even the father of the Constitution knew that a separation of powers wouldn't be enough to limit the power of the federal government. James Madison recognized that even with a good framework, government couldn't be trusted to follow the rules given to it. In Federalist No. 48, he wrote, "Will it be sufficient to mark with precision the boundaries of these departments in the Constitution of the government, and to trust to these parchment barriers against the encroaching spirit of power? But experience assures us that the efficacy of the provision has been greatly overrated, and that some more adequate defense is indispensably necessary for the more feeble against the more powerful members of the government." Madison was saying that we need something outside the federal government to enforce the constitutional limits on federal power. Why? He referred to parchment barriers. Governments don't limit their own power, and documents simply can't enforce themselves. The Constitution is quite clear on war power. The power to declare war is found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Constitution. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 of the Constitution, on the other hand, refers to the President as the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. Taken together, this means that once war is declared by Congress, the President has the responsibility, as the Commander-in-Chief, to wage the war. Alexander Hamilton talked about this when he said that the President, while lacking the power to declare war, would have the direction of war when authorized. Preemptive strikes and undeclared offensive military expeditions are not powers delegated to the executive branch in the Constitution, and therefore are unconstitutional. Thomas Jefferson covered this quite eloquently when in 1801 he said that as president, he was unauthorized by the Constitution, without the sanction of Congress, to go beyond the line of defense. When acting without a congressional declaration of war, the president is authorized only to repel a military invasion or a sudden attack. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson, James Madison explained why the Constitution divided war powers this way. He wrote, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all government demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature." There simply is no debate. Congress, not the president, decides if the country will go to war and when. One of the most maligned parts of the Constitution is the so-called General Welfare Clause. Rather than admitting they're in favor of violating the Constitution, supporters of various federal programs will often just twist the original meaning of constitutional clauses to fit what they want the government to do. The General Welfare Clause is in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution. It reads, "The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States." While some people like to claim that this means the federal government can tax and spend money on whatever it deems to fall under the general welfare, James Madison completely disagreed. In a 1792 letter to Edmund Pendleton, Madison explained the original legal meaning of the clause. He wrote, "If Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and will promote the general welfare, the government is no longer a limited one possessing enumerated powers, but an indefinite one subject to particular exceptions. It is to be remarked that the phrase out of which this doctrine is elaborated is copied from the old Articles of Confederation, where it was always understood as nothing more than a general caption to the specified powers, and it is a fact that it was preferred in the new instrument for that very reason as less liable than any other to misconstruction." In other words, the federal government may provide for the general welfare, but it must do so within the scope of the powers delegated to it in the Constitution. If you're counting on a federal politician to do what you want them to do, you're going to be seriously disappointed. Here's how Patrick Henry put it in a 1788 speech. "Show me that age and country where the rights and liberties of the people were placed on the sole chance of their rulers being good men, without a consequent loss of liberty?" In other words, relying heavily or solely on federal elections to get the job done is not just a failed strategy. It's dangerous. The United States are not one singular nation. Instead, the Constitution created a federal republic. This difference might seem like semantic nitpicking, but it is a very important distinction. In a national system, the central government has complete control. The states would be mere corporations subject to the will of the central authority. In a federal system, the general government can only exercise the limited powers delegated to it, and the states or people deal with almost everything else. It's no wonder that almost every Washington, D.C. politician and bureaucrat push so hard to sell the idea of one nation. Empowering a national government means more power for them and less liberty for you. But the founders never intended to create that kind of system. Even Alexander Hamilton made this clear in Federalist number 32, where he wrote, "An entire consolidation of the states into one complete national sovereignty would imply an entire subordination of the parts, and whatever powers might remain in them would be altogether dependent on the general will. But the plan of the convention aims only at a partial union or consolidation. The state governments would clearly retain all rights of sovereignty which they before had, and which were not by that act exclusively delegated to the United States." Hamilton was far from alone, but during the Massachusetts ratification debates, Fisher Ames gave a stark warning that's been totally ignored over the last 100 years. He said a consolidation of the states would subvert the new Constitution. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. The Founding Fathers were virtually unanimous in their strong opposition to war as a policy. Few were more adamant about this view than James Madison. In 1795, he wrote, "Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few." Today, in the United States of America, you'll find the largest and most expensive military force in the history of the world, an unpayable national debt of $19 trillion and rising, and pretty massive taxes too. So if you're not already under the domination of the few, at this pace, you eventually will be. James Madison summed it up this way: "No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare." So the next time some politician promotes another war as a way to supposedly protect your freedom, don't believe them. They're lying to you. Where do you go to figure out the original meaning of the Constitution? Well, the source, the people who gave it legal force. This is exactly how Thomas Jefferson told us to do it as well. He said, "On every question of construction, let us carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or intended against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed." Whenever there's a tragedy, people across the political spectrum call for government to do something. They don't seem to care if that something means violating the Constitution. They'll just say the document is outdated or the founders couldn't have foreseen the tragedy that just happened. This very popular and very unfortunate mentality has driven the federal government to do all kinds of unconstitutional things: wage costly and deadly wars, enact gun control measures, spy on everyone, mandate that people buy things, ban plants, take over airports, and so much more. Sometimes these measures are pushed by the left, and sometimes by the right. It's my view, though, that both sides work together against the Constitution and your liberty. All of this is based on fear. People are afraid that they're going to be hurt at every turn, so they cry out to the government to protect them. Their fear drives them to forget their liberty. Patrick Henry noticed this lack of backbone even in his day. In a 1788 speech, he said, "When the American spirit was in its youth, the language of America was different. Liberty, sir, was then the primary object." Today, things are much worse, and Ben Franklin's famous warning seems to be ignored at every turn. He wrote, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Bottom line, there is no liberty versus safety debate. We can only be safe when we're free. Would government people ever lie to us about foreign threats as a way to get more power for themselves? Bring this up in a conversation and you'll find most people will raise an eyebrow, or laugh at you, or call for tinfoil hats. But at least one leading founding father not only thought it was possible, but considered it the norm. In 1798, during the lead-up to the signing of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which among other things empowered wholesale deportation and the criminalization of free speech, James Madison made some observations about using fear to take liberty. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson, he wrote, "Perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged against provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad." Remember that quote the next time you're told to give up a little liberty to get some temporary safety. Thomas Jefferson saw the 10th Amendment as the foundation of the Constitution. In his 1791 opinion against the constitutionality of a national bank, he wrote, "I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people." This probably comes as a surprise, but when Alexander Hamilton was arguing for ratification of the Constitution, he swerved into the truth and inadvertently made the case for nullification through non-cooperation. We'll talk about that next. In Federalist number 16, Hamilton was trying to convince his readers that the federal government needed more power than it had under the Articles of Confederation. As he saw it, one of the biggest problems was that under the Articles, the states had to act in order for anything to get done. For example, Congress could only make requests of funds to the states. It could not directly tax people, property, or commerce. If the states refused to fill a requisition, Congress was essentially powerless to enforce its will. And on this, Hamilton wrote, "If the interposition of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, they have only not to act, or to act evasively, and the measure is defeated." Well, this is exactly the situation we have today. Because of massive unconstitutional overreach, the federal government depends on state action to do almost everything. It needs state resources and state personnel to enforce its laws and implement its programs. By simply doing nothing, states have the power to stop federal actions dead in their tracks. Supporters of the monster state often refer to our work here at the 10th Amendment Center as anti-government. To them, of course, this label is a negative, but prominent founders like Thomas Paine would have disagreed. In Common Sense, he wrote, "Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one." In a world where government spies on you, lies to you, takes massive amounts of your money, wages wars in your name, restricts your right to defend yourself, being anti-government isn't a bad thing. It's a badge of honor. In Federalist number 48, James Madison described constitutions as parchment barriers. He wrote, "Will it be sufficient to mark with precision the boundaries of these departments in the Constitution of the government, and to trust to these parchment barriers against the encroaching spirit of power?" He also said that something else other than the Constitution is needed for enforcement, no matter how good the Constitution might be. This is the security which appears to have been principally relied on by the compilers of most of the American constitutions. But experience assures us that the efficacy of the provision has been greatly overrated, and that some more adequate defense is indispensably necessary for the more feeble against the more powerful members of the government. Here's the short version. Constitutions don't enforce themselves, and governments will never limit their own power.
Almost a decade before the Declaration of Independence, John Dickinson, often referred to as the penman of the Revolution, gave some timeless strategic advice on how to approach government overreach. Starting in 1767, in response to the Townshend Acts, John Dickinson wrote a series of 12 essays known as Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. In his first, he spent time discussing the last of the acts, the New York Restraining Act, which was punishment for the Assembly of New York, suspending its legislative powers for failing to fully comply with orders from the Crown. Dickinson wrote, "If the Parliament may lawfully deprive New York of any of her rights, it may deprive any or all the other colonies of their rights, and nothing can possibly so much encourage such attempts as a mutual inattention to the interests of each other. To divide and thus to destroy is the first political maxim in attacking those who are powerful by their union." He continued to say that, in essence, the rightful response at that moment would have been for other assemblies to have passed a non-binding resolution informing Parliament that the act was a violation of rights and that it should be repealed. Why? Well, his answer came through clearly in his signature, where he wrote the Latin phrase Concordia res parve crescunt. It means small things grow great by concord. Clearly, the penman of the Revolution was right, and small things did grow great in the coming years. In many ways, today's federal government has suspended the legislative power of state governments by assuming control over powers never delegated to the federal government by the Constitution. In recent years, we've seen glimpses of small things growing great once again. In 2007 and 2008, the simple introduction of non-binding state resolutions affirming the 10th Amendment has grown into a movement.
What is the federal government constitutionally authorized to do? The short answer, according to James Madison that is, not a whole lot. You'll often hear us talk about the feds being limited to enumerated powers. But what exactly does that mean? It's not nearly as complicated as it might seem. In fact, James Madison explained the basic structure of the American constitutional system in a single paragraph of Federalist Paper number 45. The so-called Father of the Constitution wrote that powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined. Those left to the states are numerous and indefinite. That tells us a whole lot right there. Clearly, the federal government was meant to do a small number of things. That infers a number we can count. On the other hand, Madison said most things would be left to the people of the states. So many things, we can't even count them all. But Madison didn't stop there. He went on to explain the basic scope of federal power, saying it would be exercised primarily on things like war, peace, negotiations with other nations, and foreign commerce. Madison called these external objects. Then he tells us that everything else is reserved to the states. Madison said state power encompasses all objects, which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. That means that almost everything is supposed to be handled at the state and local level, including healthcare, marriage, education, environmental protection, transportation, drug laws, and more. The list can go on and on and on. So the next time you're wondering if the federal government can do something, stop and think about which of Madison's categories it falls under. The answer is probably no. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. Most people today have absolutely no sense at all of how small the federal government is supposed to be under the Constitution. But a 19th century veto from President James Madison helps explain. Today, the feds are involved in just about everything. We take it for granted that they are supposed to be creating healthcare systems, regulating pollution, and even telling us what kind of light bulbs we can use. But the truth is, the feds aren't supposed to be doing any of those things. In fact, they shouldn't be doing most things they do today. Did you know the federal government shouldn't even be funding infrastructure? It might sound shocking, but it's true. Just look through the Constitution and you won't find any delegated powers relating to such a thing. In fact, James Madison actually vetoed a public works bill funding infrastructure in 1817, calling it unconstitutional. The bill was for constructing roads and canals and improving the navigation of watercourses in order to facilitate, promote, and give security to internal commerce among the several states. Virtually every American today would say that this is exactly what the feds should be doing. But the father of the Constitution disagreed. Madison said, "The legislative powers vested in Congress are specified and enumerated, and it does not appear that the power proposed to be exercised by the bill is among the enumerated powers, or that it falls by any just interpretation with the power to make laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution those or other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States." The amazing thing is that Madison actually favored the bill personally, but he vetoed it anyway because he put the Constitution above his personal policy preferences. That's the kind of integrity you should never count on from Washington, D.C. today. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. People often say they want a strong president who can get things done. But that's pretty much opposite of what the Founding Fathers set up under the Constitution. Before the American Revolution, colonial governors ruled with almost total authority. They had absolute veto power over legislatures and the authority to issue edicts that carried the force of law. They could create law with the stroke of a pen. It was basically the colonial version of executive orders, as they're so often used today. When the people declared independence and states began drafting their own constitutions, they vowed to end this kind of power. In a nutshell, the founding generation believed that only a radical destruction of that kind of authority in one person could prevent the resurgence of total power throughout the country. This carried over into the drafting of the Constitution. The royal governors represented the executive branch that the founders were most familiar with. Their experience with those guys was the reason they were determined to strictly limit presidential power. In fact, when famed founding-era legal expert St. George Tucker explained executive authority in his commentary on the Constitution, he wrote that we shouldn't even talk in terms of presidential powers, but we should more properly call them duties. James Madison also clearly defined the limited nature of presidential authority in an essay known as Helvidius No. 1. He wrote, "The natural province of the executive magistrate is to execute laws, as that of the legislature is to make laws. All his acts, therefore, properly executive, must presuppose the existence of the laws to be executed." Today, this wisdom has been flipped on its head. Where the founders rejected sweeping executive power, many Americans today embrace, and more dangerously, they often beg for it. Under the Constitution, the president was delegated the authority to execute laws passed by Congress, not create them with the stroke of a pen. Insisting that the Constitution has a fixed meaning isn't blind dogmatism. It's the cornerstone of the system created by the Founding Fathers. In 1767 and 1768, the English Parliament passed a series of laws known as the Townshend Acts. Several of the acts levied taxes, which were not only meant to raise revenue, but more generally to set the precedent that Parliament had the authority to tax the colonies. The Townshend Acts led to widespread protests in the colonies and sparked the cry, "No taxation without representation." The acts also included the New York Restraining Act, which shut down the colony's legislative assembly as punishment for its refusal to comply with the Quartering Act. In response to the Townshend Acts, Samuel Adams and James Otis wrote what became known as the Massachusetts Circular Letter. The thrust of their argument was that the taxes were unconstitutional because Massachusetts was not represented in Parliament. The Massachusetts House of Representatives gave official support to the letter in February 1768. Under pressure from British officials, the Massachusetts General Court refused to revoke this approval, and the governor responded by dissolving the assembly. That led to riots in Boston and ultimately the American Revolution. But the letter had an even deeper significance. In it, Adams and Otis laid out a principle that would form the foundation of American constitutionalism: that the meaning of a constitution cannot be altered by the whims of government. They wrote, "In all free states, the Constitution is fixed, and as the supreme legislative derives its power and authority from the Constitution, it cannot overleap the bounds of it without destroying its own foundation. That the Constitution ascertains and limits both sovereignty and allegiance." Today, many Americans embrace the opposite, and we see the results in a federal government that claims power over nearly every aspect of our lives. As Samuel Adams and James Otis warned, supporting the idea of a living, breathing Constitution has destroyed our foundation. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. Some people want you to believe that we should always defer to Washington, D.C. and conflicts between state and federal power, but they've pretty much got things backwards. St. George Tucker was a well-known founding-era jurist and legal scholar. He wrote the first extended commentary on the Constitution after it was ratified. View of the Constitution of the United States was published in 1803 and served as an important handbook for American law students, lawyers, judges, jurists, and statesmen for the first half of the 19th century. Tucker emphasized how conflicts between federal power and states or the people should be treated. He wrote, "The powers delegated to the federal government are, in all cases, to receive the most strict construction that the instrument will bear, where the rights of a state or of the people, either collectively or individually, may be drawn into question." In other words, if you have the choice of interpreting a given provision of the Constitution in a way that gives the federal government more power or in a way that gives it less power, you should always err on the side of limiting federal power and supporting the states or the people. Under the Constitution, the states and the people are supposed to get the benefit of the doubt, not the federal government. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. If you believe, like I do, that taxation is theft, you might be interested in what Samuel Adams had to say on the subject. Some people say that we should wait for the Supreme Court to overturn a federal law, rule, or regulation before we exercise our rights. Or they tell us we should spend our time pressuring the Congress to overturn laws they created. But Thomas Jefferson saw things differently. Here's what he had to say. A free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. In other words, we the people need to exercise our rights whether the government wants us to or not. During the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, a little-known founder made the case that the ultimate power resides with the people, and the combined tools of resistance and jury nullification can protect liberty even in the face of a government that won't follow the Constitution. Here's how Theophilus Parsons put it when he rose to speak on January 23, 1788. The people themselves have it in their power effectually to resist usurpation without being driven to an appeal to arms. An act of usurpation is not obligatory, it is not law, and any man may be justified in his resistance. Let him be considered as a criminal by the general government, yet only his own fellow citizens can convict him. They are his jury, and if they pronounce him innocent, not all the powers of Congress can hurt him, and innocent they certainly will pronounce him if the supposed law he resisted was an act of usurpation. I often say that voting the bums out is not just a failed strategy, but also the wrong one for what we're facing today. Thomas Jefferson had some interesting advice on this as well. He said that replacing politicians was the right strategy for an abuse of the delegated powers. Simply put, if the government is still operating within the confines of the Constitution, but just making bad policy decisions, then voting the bums out is the right approach. But when government assumes powers which have not been delegated in the Constitution, a different approach should always be used. How does that apply today? Well, if you look at the limits of the Constitution and compare it with what the federal government has been doing, I'd say the answer is pretty easy.